So this video is going to be about three things, and that is Capture One, portraits, and Classic Negative. Hi everybody, my name is Zach Mendez. I'm a photographer and arts administrator based in Santa Barbara, California. And in today's video, I'm going to be editing portraits in Capture One using the Fujifilm Classic Negative film simulation. So if you're watching this video, you might be wanting to learn a little bit more about Classic Neg, or maybe the Fujifilm film simulations just in general. These are essentially color profiles that Fujifilm has incorporated into their cameras. Classic Negative is a relatively new film simulation, and I made a video about it a while back, so you can watch that to just get a sense of how it looks across a variety of different images. It's a relatively new film simulation. It's not available on all Fujifilm cameras. It's available on the newer cameras like the X-Pro3, the X-T4, the X100V. So I have a little collection of portraits that I've just pulled from some of my client shoots over the past few months. These were all shot on my X-Pro3 with a variety of different lenses. Obviously we're in Capture One, but you can also edit Fujifilm files in Lightroom. I know a lot of people have issues with how Lightroom handles the Fujifilm files, and it's true Capture One is a little bit better, but I do still use Lightroom on Fujifilm files. I don't exclusively use Capture One, but I do enjoy Capture One. It's a fun program to use. So why is this interesting? Like, it's just gonna be me editing some portraits. It's interesting because I wouldn't use Classic Negative on most portraits. You'll see in these examples that Classic Negative is a really punchy film simulation. It can be saturated at times, and specifically with people, it can make skin tones appear a little bit orange and a little bit saturated. And we're gonna see how it applies to these images in a variety of different lighting scenarios and settings, so you can see how it sort of shifts and changes. It's a really versatile film simulation. It's very interesting, and it's actually quite beautiful, but I think it won't be practical in all situations, especially when you're working with clients. But we're gonna take a look at how it handles these files, and you can make your own decision about where and when and how you would use Classic Negative. All right, so here we are in Capture One. If you know a little bit about Capture One, you'll notice that this is the pretty standard layout here. I'm not gonna go into too much detail about how Capture One works. If you're not familiar with the software, all you should know is that it's very customizable, and in order to really learn how to use it, you need to get in here and play around with it and use it for yourself. They do make a free version that you can download and use. It just has limited features. I have the Fujifilm version that I just bought. I don't have a subscription, it's just a one-time purchase, and it only works for Fujifilm files. So here we are in it. This is my cousin Morgan, and we're just gonna start here in the exposure panel, and we're gonna apply the Classic Negative film simulation. Now, here is where it is. See, it says curve. This is where the color profiles are in Capture One, and you can see here they all are, and if we sort of scroll through, we have Acros, Astia, Classic Chrome, here's Classic Neg. So right away you can see it's quite punchy. It has a sort of saturated feel in the skin, but it's also sort of faded with these crushed blacks in a way. It's very nice. I really like this look, but it is a choice, and that's why I wouldn't always use it for portraits. But I'm not going to talk too much. We're just going to go in here and just make a few tweaks, basic edits. So I think I might start by, straightening it out a little bit, maybe giving it a little bit of a crop. Bringing this down, that's looking pretty good. I might boost the exposure just a touch and bring down the highlights a little bit, and maybe just bring down the black point a little bit. And we will just make a little bit of an S curve here. I like to do this just to make sure that we have a little bit of crushed blacks, we have a little bit of faded whites, and we have a contrast in this little S curve. I might bring down the highlights just a touch more. And let's see what we're looking like. That's the original, and that's after. And I think that this looks pretty cool. We're gonna leave it here. It's a little bit punchy, it's a little bit saturated, but I think it works in this case. Okay, I'm just gonna go ahead and copy these settings, and we're gonna apply them to this next image. So let's just see how this works if we apply the settings. Okay, so it made it a little bit more blue. I think it might just be an issue with the white balance. Let's see what daylight looks like. Cloudy. It's a little bit better. I might increase the contrast here, bring down the highlights, maybe bring down the exposure a little bit. Just sort of tweak a little bit until we find something that we like. It's looking okay. And that's the before, that's the after. Here's a fun one of her just walking away. Let's apply those settings and just see. See, I think this instantly looks great. So again, I just copied the settings from this first photo and I've applied them to this photo. This is how I work usually when I'm editing images. I'll get one picture in a set to where I think it looks good, and if the images that follow are from the same set, if they're in a similar sort of lighting situation, a similar sort of vibe, I'll often just copy the settings and apply them and then tweak as needed. I think this one worked pretty well. Maybe I'll just boost the shadows a little bit and maybe bring down the black point, but I think that that looks pretty good, and I like what Classic Negative does in this situation. See, it just makes it look more like film. Oh, one thing I forgot. I don't know how I forgot this is embarrassing, but Capture One has a really great grain feature. So this sort of, I want to look like film. So I'm gonna move into here, into the details. We have sharpening. I don't really mess around with sharpening a lot. I sort of leave it at the default, unless I find that I really need to sharpen something. Here's film grain in Capture One, which is great. I think it's much better than Lightroom. I wish Lightroom had more options than they do. But here I like the silver rich film grain. And if I apply this, I usually bring it up to like 30-ish%. You can't really tell from you know, the macro level, but if you zoom in, you can start to see the film grain. And it's this really, really nice fine grain. I might actually bring it up just a little bit more, maybe like 40. How's that looking? Yeah, I think that's looking pretty good. That's the before and that's the after. Okay, here's another photo. Now this one is not from the same set, so I'm gonna just start from scratch. So we'll go back to exposure. So auto in the curve, you'll see auto. This is what the camera was set to when it captured the image. So if I'm shooting the Fujifilm camera and I have Classic Negative selected, all of the JPEGs that I'm making with the camera will automatically be embedded with the Classic Negative film simulation. The raw files, however, are going to be raw. They're going to maintain all that detail and have a relatively flat profile for editing later in post. But when you bring them into Capture One, there's this auto function that's just default, and so it'll show you what the image looked like when you shot it. So this may have been standard, I'm not really sure. But if I had shot this image on my Fujifilm X-Pro3 in Classic Negative with that film simulation selected, this would already be showing the Classic Negative film simulation. But it's not, so we'll go ahead and change it here. So that's Classic Neg. And as you can see, it sort of has a completely different feel in this image. This image is a little bit brighter. It's a little bit more exposed than those other images we were working with. And I find that in most cases, Classic Negative works really well when you have images of people that are sort of a little bit overexposed, a little bit lighter than you typically would. It just looks beautiful. And in this case, I think it looks great. I might, again, just make a little bit of an S-curve here. This is really something that I do a lot of the time. And that just brings in a little bit of contrast. I might actually bring down the highlights a touch because she's getting a little bit too hot there. And maybe just increase the contrast a little bit before, after. And again, this is a very, you know, it's quite a choice. Again, you know, it's a little bit punchy, contrasty, but I really actually love it. And then I'll also add some grain here. I typically add grain in all of my images. So you can see what this does. It looks a little bit more filmic here, just adding this grain. All right, I'm gonna copy these settings and I'm gonna apply them to this next image and just see what happens. Yeah, so that looks pretty good. As you can see, here's a before, here's an after. It just brings really nice life. And again, this is a pretty light image. So I think the Classic Neg actually looks really beautiful here. We've added a little bit of contrast to really make this pop. I think this looks great. I might just add a little bit more contrast. So go back to our exposure panel, bring down the black point a little bit, maybe make this a little bit harder of an S-curve, And that looks pretty cool. Like it. Okay, here's a studio image. And again, we're gonna just start from scratch here. I'm going to apply the Classic Negative film simulation, and already you can see this is just having applied the Classic Neg film sim. That's before, that's after. So, I mean, it makes a huge difference. I mean, there's more contrast, it's a little bit more faded, it seems more saturated. When I say faded, I think it's the blacks that are faded and the colors are more saturated. And so let's bring up the shadows a little bit. And I think I might actually increase the exposure globally and then bring down the highlights just a little bit so she's not too hot on her face. And that's actually looking quite nice. She looks a little bit orange to me, just a little bit. Let's see what happens if I, just the white balance. Yeah, that's a little bit better. Before and after, before and after. Let's try this again. Yeah, that's a little bit better. And I will also add some grain here, silver grain. Again, we'll increase it to maybe 40-ish. Yeah, I think that looks really nice. I am loving that. Beautiful. Again, this is shot on my X-Pro3. This was using the 35mm lens. You can see down here the settings. Super happy with that. Here's another one. This is also in the studio from the same shoot. This actually was shot with natural light, obviously. This one was shot with a strobe. This one is shot with natural light. So let's just copy the settings and paste them. I just am curious what happens. Yeah, so that looks pretty nice. Let's go to our exposure panel and make a little bit of tweaks. Might bring down the shadows just a little bit, bring down the exposure a little bit, bring down the highlights a little bit more. That's a before, that's after, before, after. So you can see it actually is working really, really nicely on these pictures. And again, this is the 35mm f2 lens shot at f2.2. And I mean, the sharpness that you're getting with this lens almost wide open is really great. By the way, I have a video about the 35mm f2 coming out soon. It's the prime that I use most on my Fujifilm X-Pro3. If you're interested in that video, make sure you're subscribed so you can see it when it comes out. Here's another image. I'm just gonna copy these settings again and apply them to this one. Okay, so this didn't work as well. Let's boost our exposure, bring down the white point a little bit, bring up our shadows a little bit. Before, after. Okay, I'm just gonna reset this because it's not working out. Let's go ahead and make it Classic Neg. There we go, and let's bump our shadows up. It's looking pretty good. Yeah, that's looking nice. Let's desaturate this a little bit. I think it's just a little bit too saturated for me. And I might give it a little bit of an S-curve. Yeah, and then maybe just increase the exposure overall a little bit, bring down the highlights even more, bring down the whites even more. And that's a before. That's an after, a little bit too high shadows, I think. Before, after. Before, after. And then maybe I'll add some grain. Yeah, that's looking nice. I think it's still like just a little bit too saturated for me. So let's bring it down. Yeah, that's looking good. So we'll leave that there. Here's another studio shot. So this one actually was shot in camera with the Classic Negative film simulation selected. So you can see if I change it to Classic Neg, it's gonna look the same as it does on auto. So that's Classic Neg and that's auto. So we don't have to change anything in this case. In this case, I'm going to bring down our exposure. It's a little bit too exposed. I might bring down the highlights just because it's a little bit too much. Might bring up the shadows just a touch. And again, we'll create a little bit of an S-curve. So you can see just very basic adjustments, nothing too crazy. And again, we'll add some silver rich grain, about 43. It's looking pretty good. Actually, you know, for this one, let's change it up. Let's look at the different types of grain. Cubic grain, let's see, maybe tabular grain, and we'll increase the granularity and the impact. Make it really grainy. Let's go back to our exposure panel. I'm gonna just decrease the saturation a little bit, bring down the highlights a little bit more, maybe bring down the white point a little bit more, blacks a little bit more. And that's a before, that's an after, before, after. I think that's looking pretty cool. It's very stylized, obviously. I might bring the exposure back and I might bring in a little bit more saturation. Before, after, after. Love it. Here's a photo of my friend Laura. Now these are backlit. Let's see what happens when we apply Classic Neg. There it is. That's before, that's after we applied Classic Neg. Some more contrast. Let's increase the exposure, bump up the shadows, decrease the highlights, maybe a little bit more shadows, decrease the blacks, give it a little bit of a S-curve. Looks good. I'm gonna bring up the exposure even more. That's probably good. And bring down the highlights, bring down the whites. That's before, that's after. Let's bring in a little bit more warmth. Yeah, that looks nice. Before, after, we're gonna bring in some grain, silver rich, 32. It's looking pretty good, you guys. Let's copy this, and we're gonna paste it on this one. Looks great. I might add a little bit more contrast. Yeah, that looks nice. And I might bring down the exposure just a touch, bring down the whites, bring down the highlights a little bit more. So that's before, that's after, before, after. Here's another one that uses a lot of greens. Let's apply the Classic Negative, and boom, immediately it looks really great. Before, after, before, after. Might bring down the highlights a little bit. I might boost the shadows just a touch, bring down the black point, maybe give it a little bit of an S-curve. And that looks pretty good. Before, after, we'll leave it there. And now we'll end with a portrait of yours truly. I just took these the other day. I was filming some YouTube videos in my little studio setup, and I decided to snap some self-portraits. So here's me with the X-Pro3 in the studio. It looks pretty great. This was shot at f8, and the quality, the clarity of the sensor is really just beautiful. Right off the bat, let's go ahead and change it to Classic Neg. Okay, so you can see it's quite a substantial change. As we've noticed, the white balance in this picture is way off. Let's try to correct that. That's a little bit better. That's the before, that's after. Let me pick a different, no. Sometimes you have to try the eyedropper in a few different places to get a proper white balance if you're using that feature, I think. And then I'm gonna tweak it even a little bit more, maybe bring in some more green, some more warmth. So before, that's after. And again, same idea here. We're gonna just make a little bit of an S-curve to create some contrast. want my photos to feel a little bit filmic, so I always boost the black point and I drop the white point, just so we have a little bit of that faded look to it. I'm gonna bring down the highlights a little bit just to recover some of that information on my face, bring down the white point a little bit. I think the shadows are fine. We'll bring down the black point just a touch. And let's see what that's looking like. That's the before, that's the after. Maybe we'll bring down the highlights a little bit more. Yeah, I think that's good. That looks great. And then I'm gonna also bring in some silver rich grain. See what happens if we bring it up to 40, maybe 50, and we'll also increase the granularity. This one's kind of stylized, so I like having a little bit punchier grain. And I think that's looking really beautiful, you guys. So that's the before, that's the after. Really cool, like stylized portrait, very punchy, contrasty. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope it's given you a sense of what editing images in Capture One is like. I really actually enjoy the software. It's pretty great. I, for a long time, was hesitant to try Capture One because I was very stuck in the I have to use Lightroom only, it's my way of life mindset, and Lightroom is still my primary editing software. But I do really enjoy using Capture One, especially like on personal work, and it's really great for editing Fujifilm files if you use a Fujifilm camera. And I think the option to just be able to buy it outright and have it for one camera system, it's relatively inexpensive and it's really great to use. You have some great functionality. I also hope you've enjoyed seeing some of these examples of how Classic Negative can be applied to portraiture. Like I said, it is a very stylistic look, but I really love it. It's been on my camera most of the time. I really enjoy it for various scenarios, you know, landscape, street photography, which I do like this much of, but I've done a little bit and it's worked great. Portraiture, I even enjoy it when it's portraits that I'm making for myself. Like I said before, I wouldn't necessarily use this for my client work because I try to develop consistency in my work, because consistency builds trust and I want my clients to experience that consistency when I shoot with them. But I do sometimes, you know, bring along my X-Pro3, capture some images and edit them with Classic Neg. It's exciting to be able to have a little bit of something different to sort of throw in to the mix when you're shooting with clients. So you might find that using Classic Negative is valuable to you. Anyway, I hope that this has been helpful. If you've enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. Give me a like, leave me a comment, let me know what you think about Classic Neg, what you've been using it on, how you've found editing it works for you. I'd really be interested in knowing how you like it and how it works out for you. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.